An Asian American woman boards a first-class flight, expecting a quiet trip across the country, but within minutes, she's treated like she doesn't belong. The flight crew mocks her, questions her seat, and denies her the meal she paid for. They thought she was just another passenger. Easy to humiliate what they didn't know. She owns the airline. 7 minutes after landing, the entire crew is out of a job. What happened in between will leave you speechless. This is a story about power, prejudice, and justice at 30,000 feet. Stay with me, because this is one story you'll be thinking about long after it ends. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more real stories that matter at all. Started on an ordinary flight. There she sat, not draped in the armor of title or status, but in quiet flesh and memory. Elise Park, a Korean-American woman whose stillness had never been mistaken for power. And yet, power was precisely what she carried. The plane hummed low with the expectancy of takeoff, the mechanical murmur barely covering the subtle dance of eyes that moved to her seat. 2A, first class. It was the kind of gaze born of centuries, part suspicion, part surprise, and entirely soaked in the expectation that someone like her was simply visiting a seat not her own. The attendant approached her like a man entering a room he already claimed. His name tag read Bradley Cooper, a name that echoed boardrooms and golf courses. His smile was hollow, rehearsed, and not meant for her. He looked at Elise not with curiosity but calculation. She offered her boarding pass with the calm of a woman who had read the scene before, and yet still found it bitter to taste. "You're sure this is your seat?" he asked, not bothering to lower his voice. His tone wasn't curious. It was accusatory. Elise simply nodded, tapping the laminated card. "Seat 2A. Her voice was a whisper, deliberate. "Yes, this is where I belong." But belonging, in this place, had always been conditional. The moment he walked away, Elise saw the curtain twitch on the borders of civility. Whispers. Side eyes. The quiet hum of old prejudice dressed in the clean linen of professionalism. This was not the first flight she'd taken, but it would be the one they would remember. Elise had built her empire quietly. She was not the face splashed across magazines or the woman profiled in Forbes, though they had tried. Instead, she had built Tangram Dynamics from the cracked asphalt of immigrant dreams, her parents' corner store in Queens, her own code typed under flickering lamps in college dorms, every yes earned after 24 no's, each yes a little louder than the last. But this flight was different. She hadn't booked it as CEO. No press team. No priority call ahead. Just her name, her body, her skin. A test not just of service, but of how deep the rot had grown in the machine she had, months ago, acquired in silence. American TriStar Airways. It was not ownership she wanted, it was revelation. And the revelation was coming fast. Bradley returned to deliver champagne to every seat but hers. She waited. Watched. Said nothing. When she raised her hand, he turned with a blank smile, as if seeing her for the first time. "I didn't get a glass," she said gently. Bradley glanced down. "Oh," he said flatly. "It's possible you're in the economy. Sometimes there's a mix-up with upgrades." "No mix-up," she replied. "Check again." The other passengers were watching now. A man in 2B looked away, uncomfortable. An older white woman in 3A pursed her lips. Another attendant, Melinda, stood nearby with her tray, not intervening, but close enough to hear. She smirked. Elise caught it. The champagne came. Half a flute. No bubbles. Elise held the glass, let it tilt in her hand. It wasn't the drink, it was the ritual of erasure. The insistence that she explain herself. The quiet refusal to see her as deserving, no matter the paper she held. She knew this game. It was older than her. And so she took her phone. Not to record video, yet, but to log each incident with the coolness of someone who knew, in the marrow, that justice was a slow walker, but a sure one. Elise didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She simply made space for the story to write itself in real time. Meal service came. She had requested to be vegetarian. They brought her pork. When she raised it, Bradley said, "I don't have you down for any special meals." "I have confirmation," she replied, offering her phone. He barely looked. "You people always think you can just ask and we'll adjust. You people." There it was. The slip. The slow rot was visible. Melinda chuckled from the galley. Guess next time she'll bring her own food. Elise sat back. No anger in her face. Just knowing. The waiting. Because the thing about power is, it doesn't always come roaring. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits in seat 2A while everyone writes their own downfall in plain view. The flight hadn't even reached cruising altitude. But the reckoning was already boarding. It was not the insult that stung Elise Park, it was the way it was wrapped. Wrapped in civility. Delivered with a smile. That, Baldwin would say, was the American gift, to wound without raising a voice. Elise sat in 2A as the plane stabilized at 32,000 feet. The sky outside was a quiet blaze of blue, serene and indifferent, while inside the cabin a storm was already forming, not loud, not sudden, but measured. Slow. Like tea steeped in poison. Bradley returned with the dessert cart. He served the strawberry tart to the older white gentleman in 2B, a silver-haired man in a navy blazer who hadn't so much as glanced in Elise's direction since boarding. Then a chocolate mousse for the woman across the aisle in 3C. Then he turned to Elise, holding a cellophane-wrapped biscotti from the coach section, and said, "Unfortunately, we're out of the others." She looked at the cart. At least 4 more tarts sat waiting, untouched. Her voice was calm, but each word landed with weight. "That's not true. There are still desserts on the cart." Bradley didn't flinch. "Those are reserved for select-tier passengers." "I'm in first class," she replied. "You booked through a partner program." "We have different standards for fare classes," he said. And there it was. Not a slur. Not a raised voice. But the falsehood of neutrality. The lie of bureaucracy used to veil the truth. She didn't look like she belonged. In his mind, that was reason enough. She could have pulled rank right then. She could have pulled out her platinum credentials. But she knew that wasn't the story anymore. Power used too quickly becomes rage. And rage, for someone who looked like her, would be the only story the passengers remembered. So she took the biscotti. She lied. And she took note. Meanwhile, Tiffany passed through with the blankets and eye masks. She handed them out like sacraments. A ritual of comfort. Each passenger received theirs with a nod, a touch on the shoulder, until she reached Elise. "Oh," Tiffany said, as if startled. "Did you need one? Is it not standard?" Elise asked. "Well, we sometimes run out." She reached into the cabinet behind her and pulled out 2 more, placing one gently on 3CS tray. Elise waited. Tiffany blinked at her. "We'll check the economy for extras," she said, and moved on. Not a denial. Not an apology. Just a shift in the story. Again, the lie wrapped in etiquette. Elise leaned back in her seat, her jaw tight, but her voice still unsaid. Around her, the cabin hummed with the safety of silence. No one intervened. No one asked questions. These were polite people. Cultured people. They had read Baldwin and Baldwin's Children, and still, they had learned nothing from them except how to quote him with guiltless ease. There is a peculiar cruelty in being treated like a stranger in your own country. Elise knew this well. Born in the boroughs of New York, raised in public libraries and corner bodegas, she had worked her way through every American promise, education, merit, resilience, and yet found herself back at the gate, knocking for entry. Always knocking. She watched as Blake approached the man in 2B once again. A second glass of wine. A laugh. A story about the Hamptons. A life Elise could have shared if she had been born white. If she had been born as expected. "You know," the man in 2B finally said, turning to Elise with a sip of his Merlot, "you handled that dessert thing very gracefully." She smiled. Politely. "What dessert thing?" He laughed awkwardly. "You know what I mean. That was clearly not right. But, well, maybe it's just one of those things. One of those things, she repeated. He nodded, mistaking repetition for agreement. Like redlining. Or being followed around department stores. Or being told your name is hard to pronounce. He stiffened. I didn't mean it like that. But it is like that, she said, her voice soft, unwavering. It's death by 1,000 courtesies. He turned away. She didn't blame him. This country taught its people to value peace over truth. Harmony over justice. But she had not built an empire by making white men comfortable. And she would not start here. The lights dimmed as the flight entered its mid-leg. But the air in 2A crackled with tension. Elise reached for her water, only to find her glass still empty, untouched since takeoff. She pressed the call button. Waited. 10 minutes passed. 15. No one came. But she could see Blake in the galley, laughing with Tiffany. She watched their lips move and knew, without hearing, that she was the subject of the joke. Not by name. Not even with words. But with the language of erasure. She got up, walked to the galley herself. Tiffany turned, startled. Can I help you? I pressed the call button for water, Elise said. Oh, must have been a system error. Blake didn't even look up. Tiffany handed her a bottle with a clumsy smile. Here you go. Anything else? Elise said nothing. She returned to her seat, uncapped the water, and drank slowly. The flight was halfway over. And so was their safety. Because this woman in 2A, this quiet, underestimated, foreign-looking woman, they didn't know she had bought the airline they worked for. They didn't know the water they denied her would soon drown their careers. They didn't know who they were serving. But they would. There is no agony quite like being made to doubt your own presence, no cut deeper than the blade of suggestion. Elise Park had felt it often. It was never loud. That would make it too easy to name. No, this kind of hatred had learned to whisper, and it did so with the calm of a steward's smile and the silence of a captain's back. The plane rumbled softly above the heartland, an iron cathedral coasting on sky. The silence inside the first-class cabin was manicured, like the hush of old money. Elise leaned back in seat 2A and watched the clouds, feeling the familiar ache behind her eyes, the one that came when you'd prepared yourself for a battle you didn't ask for but couldn't walk away from. Across the aisle, the white man in 2B was now asleep, mouth slightly open, a napkin folded neatly over his lap. Elise didn't know his name. He hadn't offered it, but he had offered the slight of casual alliance, smiling when the flight attendant ignored her, laughing a little too loudly when Tiffany mocked a passenger's accent. That kind of man didn't wear a white hood. He wore a Rolex. The second service cart rolled in. Lunch. The scent of reheated salmon and buttered rolls drifted through the air like perfume at a funeral. Blake, the same Blake who had questioned her seat, her meal, and her presence, stood beside her row again. But this time, something had changed. He skipped her entirely. He didn't ask. Didn't pretend to check. He simply moved on, sliding a steaming plate in front of 2B and then stepping over her like a crack in the sidewalk. Elise turned slowly. Excuse me. Blake paused, his expression feigned confusion. Yes, you missed me. Oh! His eyes scanned the tablet. Your name didn't come up. I pre-selected my meal. Vegetarian, she said evenly. That must be the issue, he replied, tapping the screen. You're not listed. Maybe it's a technical error. A technical error. Again. Elise breathed slowly. The trick wasn't in losing control. The trick was in letting the mask slip just enough to be seen, not as a woman scorned, but as a truth speaking. I've been here, she said, softly. You've seen me. And still, you forget me. Blake gave a nervous smile. I'll check the galley. As he walked away, Elise felt it again, the heat, not of rage, but of erasure. She remembered a time in her 20s when she walked into a conference room full of men who stopped laughing when she entered, only to resume their laughter the moment she sat down. They never said she didn't belong. They just talked around her until she left. The cabin doors were shut, but the world outside had followed her in. Racism, in its old form, had grown too recognizable. It had learned new clothes, corporate uniforms, and politeness policies. Now it sat beside you, brought you wine, and ignored your presence all the same. Tiffany appeared next, carrying a tray of warm rolls. "We're offering seconds," she said sweetly to the couple in row 3. Elise watched her approach, expecting the same silence. But this time Tiffany paused, her voice brittle. "Oh," she said, eyes wide with performance. "I'm so sorry. Did you want one?" Elise blinked once. "No, thank you." She knew what this was. Guilt in motion. A theater of grace. But guilt was not redemption, and politeness was not justice. An older white woman 2 rows back leaned toward Elise, whispering, "You handled that well." Elise turned to her. "What did I handle?" The woman recoiled. "I just meant. I saw what happened. I think you're very brave." Brave. As though surviving a denial of bread were akin to storming a beach. "Thank you," Elise said, returning to the window. "But I'd prefer not to need bravery to be treated fairly." There was a long pause. Then the woman said, "Well, at least it's not like it used to be." Elise nodded slowly. "No, now it's quiet. Quiet like a verdict already passed." Moments later, Blake returned. "We're out of vegetarian meals, but we can offer you a fruit plate." He placed a small plastic dish, 2 apple slices, 3 grapes, and half a kiwi on her tray. "I see," Elise murmured. "Is there anything else I can get you?" "Yes," she said. "Your attention. Next time." Blake said nothing. He disappeared down the aisle, his shadow stretching longer than his service. Elise sat alone. Her tray trembled with plastic and the memory of what it could have been. She reached into her bag and pulled out a notepad, not the digital kind, but the kind with paper and ink, and began writing. Not because she needed the record, but because every act of erasure demanded its own witness. As the hours passed, she was no longer hungry. She was no longer tired. She was becoming ready. The seat belt light blinked on. The captain's voice came over the speaker. A man Elise hadn't seen once, but who had the final say over everyone's safety. He spoke of turbulence, of time zones, of arrival, but never once of fairness. Because in that cabin, fairness was an illusion. And every mile forward was also a mile deeper into the reality Elise had always known. You can buy a seat in first class, but they will still try to make you feel like baggage. And that, Baldwin might say, is the cruelty of the American arrangement. You can be allowed in the room, but still denied your humanity. Elise Park didn't believe in accidents anymore. Not after 61 years of living in a country that could smile at her while it robbed her blind. Not after boarding 100 flights where her name was mispronounced, her seat doubted, her presence regarded as a question rather than a fact. She had learned that racism no longer wore uniforms, it wore manners. It spoke in policy. It smiled, said "ma'am," and still made sure you were the last to be served. As the plane cruised eastward, descending toward Chicago, Elise noticed what every seasoned traveler eventually learns to see, not just what was done, but what was withheld. She hadn't been offered a second beverage. Her trash tray still sat on her armrest while others had been cleared without a word. And when the lead flight attendant passed by for what appeared to be the 3rd round of coffee for the businessman across the aisle, Elise raised her hand. "Yes," he said, polite but clipped, like the end of a sentence that didn't need to be finished. "I'd like a cup of tea, please." He paused. "We're out." No apology. No offer of anything else. No explanation of how tea could run out before reaching row 2. Elise nodded once. That was how it worked now. Discrimination was no longer personal, it was procedural. It was the white woman behind her who had dropped her phone and, in bending to retrieve it, accidentally elbowed Elise's tray, knocking over the untouched fruit plate. "Oh dear," she had said, laughing. "These seats are just too small." Elise had dabbed at the spill in silence while the woman called for napkins, which were handed to her with a smile. Elise was not offered any. The woman didn't apologize. But she did glance back and say, my cleaning lady is Korean. You remind me of her. She's just the sweetest. Elise smiled without showing her teeth. There were 1,000 ways to say you don't belong. And none of them had to use the word race. When Elise pressed her call button, her first request in 3 hours, it went unanswered. When she pressed it again 15 minutes later, the attendant reset the light without even stopping. Just a tap and a glance. No words. The man in 2B leaned over, his tone light. You might have to wave them down. Sometimes they get busy. Busy. Elise turned toward the window. Outside, the world moved without her. But inside this cabin, every motion was a message. She looked at the man beside her. His socks matched his tie. His voice had Harvard in it. He hadn't spoken to her until now. She'd been invisible until it was convenient to observe her struggle. Have you ever had to ask for something twice? She asked him softly. He blinked. Pardon? I said, she repeated, still looking out the window. Have you ever had to ask for something twice to be heard? He didn't answer. Because men like him had never had to ask. The world had always answered on the first ring. There was a moment then, small but seismic, when Elise realized that this was the cruelty of their new world. It wasn't built to beat you down all at once. It was built to wear you out, quietly. One skipped cup of tea at a time. One polite indifference after another. A young white woman came down the aisle, wearing a cardigan and a badge that said Customer Experience Specialist. She bent down to a row behind Elise where a man had complained that the air vent was too cold. She smiled sweetly, promising to adjust the cabin temperature. She never looked at Elise. Never even turned her head. This was the trap. A white woman could be soft. She could apologize. She could give you a blanket and tell you that the system is getting better. She could offer comfort, but never correction. And the system, always clever, hid behind her like a child behind its mother's apron. Elise turned back to the aisle and watched the customer specialist walk away. Her badge swinging gently. Experience. That was the word they used now. Not equality. Not justice. Just experience. As if what else was having was an off-brand airline delay, not the slow dehumanization of decades dressed up in gloss and service surveys. She felt it then, something Baldwin once called the weight of the lie. The lie that said the fight was over, that there had been progress. Elise had lived long enough to know that the world didn't need to spit in your face to break you. It only needed to make you prove yourself at every stop. Smile through every slight. Wait while others are served. She reached into her coat pocket and touched the letter folded there. The one from the Department of Transportation, still warm from her lawyer's printer. She hadn't told anyone yet, but she had filed the complaint. She had written it, slowly, after her last flight. Not because she believed they'd change, but because she refused to let the silence win. May I get you anything now, ma'am? The voice came from behind, hesitant. It was Tiffany, suddenly aware that Elise had noticed every omission. Elise looked at her. Not angry. Not broken. Just tired. Yes, she said, without looking away. You can get me your supervisor. The words landed like stone in water. Small, but undeniable. And that was the moment, the shift. The recognition that Elise, seated quietly in 2A, saw everything. And she would not pretend otherwise. The rhythm was quickening now. The masks are thinning. And Elise Park was no longer here to make anyone feel comfortable. The supervisor's name was Jordan. He was young, black, and wore his authority like an uncertain coat, stitched too new, sleeves still stiff. Elise saw that immediately. Not because he wasn't trying, but because she knew what it meant to serve power while never possessing it. He crouched beside her row, not looking her in the eye. I understand you had a concern, ma'am, he said gently, the syllables rounded with practiced deference. The boy had likely been trained to handle problems without making noise, to calm things down before they touched policy, before they reached headlines. Elise kept her voice even. I've asked for water 3 times. I've been offered a cookie that you serve in economy. I've been asked to verify my seat. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. Jordan nodded, but she could feel him recoiling, already calculating how to explain her away, not fix the thing, but find the language to bury it softly. That's not our standard, ma'am. I'm sorry if... No, Elise cut in. Don't do that. His eyebrows lifted. Do what? Don't apologize for how I feel. Apologize for what happened. Or don't apologize at all. But don't pretend the difference isn't real. For the first time, he looked at her. Really looked. And what he saw, perhaps, was not a frail elder playing a role, but a woman older than his entire system. A woman who had lived through lunch counters, school busing, and a black president. A woman who had learned that silence, when offered instead of truth, becomes its own kind of betrayal. I'll speak to the crew, he said finally. You'll do more than that, Elise replied. You'll make a record. A passenger across the aisle, a woman with graying curls and pearls at her throat, shifted uncomfortably. Elise Park, she said loud enough for the woman to hear. That's Eli C. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the Department of Transportation and with your corporate office. Jordan scribbled something on his tablet. I understand. You don't, Elise said softly. But maybe you will. She did not yell. She did not weep. But the plane felt quieter when she finished. Because truth, when delivered with dignity, shakes more than any tantrum. As Jordan walked away, the crew grew colder. Not openly, but in their movements, their eyes, their timing. The man beside Elise, a middle-aged executive in a navy blazer, leaned over as if sharing a secret. I know how this looks, he said, sotto voce. But I don't think they meant it that way. They're probably just busy. Or understaffed. It was the oldest line in the book. The defense of intent over impact. And Elise turned to him, not with anger, but with the heavy patience of someone who had taught too many classrooms and buried too many friends. You want to know what's worse than hatred? She asked. The man blinked. Comfortable people who can't see the fire until it burns them. The people who think it's not their job to speak, only to interpret the silence. He turned away. Not out of guilt, but out of inconvenience. They always did. Later, at the baggage claim, the harm would not be a headline. It wouldn't even be remembered by the airline. But Elise would carry it. Like a paper cut you forget until the salt finds it. At the gate, while others stretched and checked phones, Elise waited. A quiet grace wrapped around her like a wool coat, warm but heavy. And as the doors opened and the crowd pressed forward, the same woman with the pearls approached. I hope you don't think we're all like that, she said awkwardly. Elise smiled with the weariness of knowing she'd heard that line in 1964 and again in 1992 and again after every election. No, Elise said. I don't think you're all like that. I just think enough of you are. And the rest don't say a word. The woman recoiled, as if the truth was an insult. And then she left, clutching her handbag tighter. Outside, the cold bit Elise's cheeks. But she was used to the weather. You had to be. Because the older you got, the more you realized racism didn't need to shout anymore. It had learned to whisper. It wore polyester uniforms. It brought champagne to the white man before you. It lost your meal. It didn't call you names. It just forgot your name. Again and again. Until forgetting became the crime itself. Elise Park lit a cigarette with trembling fingers. She no longer smoked often, but some days, the fire helped. And as the smoke curled into the sky, she thought of her mother, who had scrubbed hotel floors without ever being called ma'am. And her daughter, who now taught at Columbia and had to prove her credentials at every parent-teacher night. And the truth folded itself like a note in her pocket. They would not stop you with slurs. They would stop you with silence. With questions. With low expectations. And still, you rose. Not because you were exceptional, but because you were ready. She was ready now. The fight hadn't ended. It had just learned to dress better. Elise didn't go to the press, not yet. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew better. She'd lived long enough to see righteous noise turned into distraction. The media would twist her into a former schoolteacher seeking relevance, or worse, a bitter old woman with a grievance. So instead, she did what the powerful often feared most. She moved quietly, deliberately, and with receipts. At home in Harlem, her apartment was still warm with the scent of the chamomile tea she had brewed the night before. She sat at her old desk, the wood worn soft by years of grading papers, and typed the report. Every date, every word, every face. Her fingers didn't tremble, not anymore. She emailed it to the Civil Rights Division, CC'd her niece at the ACLU, and blind copied it to the director of the airline's Diversity and Inclusion Department, though she knew such departments were usually decorations, not engines. By noon, she had already heard back. Ms. Park, thank you for reaching out. We take these matters seriously. A case number has been opened. No phone call. No follow-up. Just a number. A number that might as well have been etched on a headstone. So Elise called instead. She asked to speak to a human, then to a supervisor, then to someone who handled bias incidents in flight. And what she got, after 4 transfers and a piano hold tone that looped like a taunt, was a woman named Debbie. Debbie was polite. Overly so. Like someone speaking to a foreigner or a child. We're just trying to determine if this was a case of misunderstanding, Debbie said, each word soft as a pillow but stiff as a noose. Elise exhaled sharply. What exactly do you think I misunderstood, Debbie? That I was served last? That I was called economy when I paid first class? That my boarding pass was checked 3 times while the man beside me snored into his mimosa? A pause. Then that bureaucratic hush Elise knew all too well. Well, Ms. Park, as you know, we are still investigating. These things take time. Time, Elise said. What you mean is you're waiting to see if I'll go away. That silenced Debbie. And Elise, satisfied with the silence, hung up. Later that week, the airline offered her a $200 voucher and a scripted apology for the inconvenience. Inconvenience. As if she had missed a connection instead of being made to feel like a trespasser on a ticket she'd earned. So Elise called her niece again. We're past letters, she said. Let's talk about strategy. And they did. It wasn't about going viral. It was about going deeper. She posted the story on a small blog read mostly by retired educators and civil rights lawyers. She joined a Zoom panel with an organization that tracked racial incidents in air travel. Her story was one among many. A Black architect was detained at the gate because his ID looked suspicious. A Latina doctor mistaken for a janitor mid-flight. A South Asian mother accused of stealing someone's blanket. Each one is polite. Each one is calm. Each one was humiliated. Elise sat through the stories and nodded. Not because she was surprised, but because she was furious at how little had changed. How the script had remained the same while the actors simply aged out. At the next meeting of her tenants' association, a young man, Tariq, asked her why she was doing all this. I mean, he said gently, you're retired, Ms. Park. You could just rest. Elise smiled, slow and knowing. Baby, she said, the people who taught me how to fight were in their 60s when I met them. I never trusted the ones who got tired early. That's how they win, by hoping we'll nap our way into silence. He laughed, but he understood. Because here was the truth. Every time Elise had been underestimated, overlooked, or politely dismissed, it had sharpened her. She didn't yell. She never cursed. But her words cut deeper than either. That week, she was invited to meet with a group of airline executives via video conference. Not because they cared, but because the story had started to climb the search results. Her face had begun to appear in forums and emails. Ms. Park, we're sorry for what you experienced, said one suited man whose name tag read Paul, VP Customer Experience. Elise didn't blink. What you're sorry for is being found out. Let's not assign blame, he countered, hands folded like a priest. Why not? She asked. You assigned blame to me without knowing my name. Why are white mistakes called errors in training and ours called attitude? No one answered. She leaned forward. Here's what I want, she said. Public acknowledgement. Discipline for the crew. A real anti-bias protocol, and not the kind where you check a box and go back to business as usual. Ms. Park, we have procedures. I've outlived procedures. I want results. And when she left that call, she didn't wait for a verdict. She was already planning the next conversation with the union, with the press, with the NAACP chapter that had already sent her flowers. The airline hadn't silenced her. They had amplified her. And somewhere, she imagined, a young attendant was learning how to smile politely while serving injustice on a tray, believing it would go unnoticed if it were done softly enough. But Elise Park was no longer in the business of softness. The time for comfort had passed. The next chapter wouldn't be written in silence. The problem with America, Elise thought, sipping from a chipped mug on her fire escape, wasn't that it lied, it was that it whispered. Whispered injustice through HR statements, through news anchors with gentle voices, through apologies that never used the word wrong. And what she had started as a single woman's stand was now growing, quietly, like mold behind a painted wall. It began with letters. Dozens. Then hundreds. Black women in Detroit. Elderly Asian men in Seattle. A Latina trans woman in Houston. People who had been almost believed by managers, nearly supported by coworkers, but ultimately erased. They wrote, I thought it was just me. They wrote, I was told I was too sensitive. They wrote, thank you. Thank you for making us visible. Elise didn't feel triumphant. She felt grieved. Because every story echoed her own, and every echo proved that the walls were still standing. One letter stayed with her. From a former flight attendant named Devin, now retired and living in Florida. Ms. Park, I saw it from the other side. I was told not to over-accommodate certain passengers because it might ruin the consistency of the brand. That was code, you know. For race. For class. For everything this country pretends it has fixed. I quit after a white supervisor asked if I could turn off the urban charm in first class. Devin had included a photo of himself in uniform. Smiling. Polished. Full of hope. Elise wept. Because what white America often called progress was just a more elegant repression. It had changed its uniform, but not its nature. Her niece helped her organize the stories. They created a website, bare bones and slow-loading but honest, where passengers and airline workers could post anonymously. They called it second class in first class. Within days, a major airline, not the one she'd flown, reached out. Not with lawyers. With fear. Can we speak privately? The email asked. Elise didn't answer. She posted their message instead, with the caption, You didn't respond when I was a passenger. You're only responding now because I've become a platform. The site exploded. A news outlet picked up her story. Then another. Then a cable anchor called her a new voice in aviation justice, and Elise had to laugh. New? She was almost 72. The black press remembered her. They ran her picture beside a grainy photo from 1981, Elise Park, protesting outside a New York school board meeting over teacher layoffs in Harlem. The past wasn't past. It just got tired of being ignored. But with visibility came retaliation. A man in a blue suit began calling her a professional victim in op-eds. A former airline VP accused her of creating racial tension where there had been none. Even a congressman took the bait, tweeting, If you don't like American Airlines, don't fly them. Her hands shook as she scrolled. Not from fear. From recognition. She had seen it before, when white parents accused her of lowering standards by teaching black literature. When administrators questioned her qualifications, even as her students soared. The tactic was always the same, Change the subject. Make it about tone, not truth. Civility, not justice. Her niece wanted her to stop. They'll twist this, she warned. They'll make you the villain. They already have, Elise replied. And I'm still breathing. So she pressed on. She filed a formal civil rights complaint through the DOT. She worked with a group of retired attorneys to create a template for others to follow. She launched a phone line, voicemail only, where victims of airline discrimination could record their stories. The calls poured in. A 12-year-old black boy accused of theft for asking for a second soda. A Sikh man was pulled from a flight after another passenger felt uneasy. A deaf woman ignored it for hours after pressing her call button. These weren't stories. They were symptoms. The next phase came without warning. One morning, Elise opened her email to see a subject line that stopped her breath. "We've been watching." The sender was anonymous. The message is short. "You've disrupted things too much. You need to stop before someone makes it stop for you." Her niece wanted to go to the police. Elise just stared out the window. She had known this day would come. In America, truth-telling has never been safe work. And so she did what her mother had done during the riots. What her father had done when police questioned him for walking home in the wrong neighborhood. She wrote down everything. Printed copies. Gave them to people she trusted. She wore her truth like armor now. And she didn't flinch. Because the threats only confirmed that the pressure point had been found. The system was hissing. It could hear the crack in its own facade. By the end of the week, 3 local news channels had aired her story. The Department of Transportation was opening a wider investigation into discriminatory airline practices. And Elise Park? She wasn't done. She stood in front of a town hall crowd in Brooklyn, packed with senior citizens, clergy, teachers, and former union organizers. The microphone buzzed. She cleared her throat. "You're not too old to fight. And you're not too tired to win." The room rose in applause. Because truth, when spoken without apology, is contagious. And a whisper, once defied, can become a roar. The town hall meeting had ended, but something had shifted in the air, less like a revolution and more like a rumble beneath concrete. The kind of movement that made buildings uneasy. Elise didn't go home that night. She sat in a quiet diner down the block, coffee cooling between her palms, watching the footage of her speech on a stranger's phone across the booth. She hadn't known someone had been live-streaming it. Over 80,000 views. Half of them hate it, the other half, a choir. She looked out at the city and thought, "I've been old for a long time. But tonight I feel ancient." The next morning, national media arrived. Not because they cared, but because they were embarrassed not to care. Elise had become a trend, and that meant she had become useful. News trucks blocked her block. Journalists leaned in with that interested liberal look, not too sympathetic, not too skeptical, always safe. "Ms. Park, what does justice look like to you? Ms. Park, do you think this movement will last? Ms. Park, what's your message to young people?" She answered the best she could. But the truth sat behind her tongue like a stone. "You don't ask white men if their justice will last." One anchor asked her about forgiveness. Elise almost laughed. Forgiveness is a garden that must be watered with repentance. Not just a headline and a handshake. Not just a press release and sensitivity training. A week later, Congress called her to testify. They put her behind a long wooden table beneath the seal of the United States. Cameras everywhere. Smiling congressmen in Navy suits who, 50 years ago, would have called her an Oriental troublemaker behind closed doors. She wore the same jacket she'd worn the day of the flight. Not as a symbol. Just because it was hers. "Ms. Park," one congressman began, "do you believe racial bias is as widespread in the airline industry as some claim?" She looked him straight in the eye. An older white man with soft hands and a veteran pin. And she said, "I don't believe it. I know it. I lived it. And so did everyone whose name you never bothered to ask." They tried to hurry her testimony. But her words came slow, deliberate, like drums at a funeral. She gave no one the comfort of closure. Because racism didn't end, it evolved. One congresswoman leaned forward. Black. Southern. 68 years old. She didn't ask a question. She just said, "We see you." And for a moment, Elise felt something rare, understood. But the opposition came swiftly. Within hours, conservative pundits were calling her a corporate plant, a grievance profiteer, the Asian Al Sharpton. They didn't know how to attack a 72-year-old widow who spoke with measured pain. So they lied louder. The threats increased. The accusations became bizarre. Someone edited her face onto Mao Zedong's body and posted it to a veterans forum. Her niece begged her to stop. But Elise had stopped being scared a long time ago. Not because she was brave, but because fear had already taken everything it could. Then, the crack. A whistleblower. A black pilot, quiet until now, submitted audio recordings from 2 years prior, private management meetings at a major airline. Senior staff joking about Southeast Asians with elite miles and diversity points ruining cabin culture. Laughs. No pushback. It made the headlines Elise never could. Executives resigned. One CEO retired for personal reasons. Stock dipped, then tumbled. And for once, they didn't bury the story. Because the voice on the recording wasn't Elise's. It was theirs. And you can't gaslight a mirror. The Department of Transportation announced new mandates for anti-discrimination audits. Airlines scrambled to publish revised equity statements. Consultants made millions crafting sincerity out of shame. But Elise watched it all like a woman who had seen too many parades and too few repairs. Change doesn't wear a suit. It walks slowly. It gets tiring. It needs to be held up by other people when its legs start shaking. She went back to the church basement where the original organizing meetings had started. Folding chairs. Bad coffee. No cameras. A woman stood up, a nurse in her 50s. "I flew last week," she said. And for the first time in 20 years, no one asked me if I was in the wrong seat. There was silence. Not a shock, but something softer. A collective hmm. A man stood up. "I got my refund after reporting bias." "That's new." Elise said nothing. She just nodded. Outside, the sky was the same cracked gray it had always been. America hadn't changed overnight. It never would. But there were now names on the record, voices on tape, and a reckoning on file. And in a country so addicted to forgetting, the simple act of remembering had become revolutionary. Before she left, a young organizer handed Elise a button. "The sky belongs to everyone." She didn't pin it on. But she kept it in her coat pocket, pressed tight in her palm like a prayer. And when she boarded her next flight, alone, as always, no one questioned her seat. No one offered her less. No one called her by the wrong name. And no one asked her to prove she belonged. But even then, she knew, justice is not a destination. It's a carry-on. You keep it with you. You guard it. You don't check it. Because you never know who's sitting next to you. And you never know who's watching.